you're listening to this podcast, chances are you've felt the heartbreaking impact of trauma and abuse in your own story, or in the stories of those you care about. The truth is, we all carry the weight of personal and collective trauma. It's part of living in this world. And yet, we also know we were made for more. We were made for connection, wholeness, and a life marked by faith, hope, and love. If you desire more for yourself, for the people you love, and for your community, I want to personally invite you into narrative-focused trauma care training with us here at the Allender Center. Narrative-focused trauma care, or NFTC for short, is a methodology developed by the Allender Center and built on the lifelong work of Dr. Dan Allender in the field of trauma and abuse recovery. It brings together psychology and theology to give you a holistic framework as you enter into your story and the stories of those around you with wisdom and care. It begins with NFTC Level 1. Throughout 4 intensive training weekends, you'll receive foundational teaching from our team. But this isn't just theory. You'll also roll up your sleeves and enter into your own story, because as Dan says, we cannot take anyone further than we've been willing to go ourselves. In small groups with a trained facilitator, you'll actually participate in the work of story engagement, sharing your story and learning to listen well to the stories of others. Whether you're a therapist, ministry leader, or simply someone longing for deeper personal healing, this training invites you into a process of exploring your story, naming both your pain and your goodness, and growing in your capacity to love and lead well. Applications for NFTC Level 1 are now open. If you're ready to begin the journey toward deeper healing in your own story and a renewed calling to bring compassion, courage, and hope to the world around you, we invite you to visit theallendercenter.org/trainings.
Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachel Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Rachel, have I given a trigger warning for any of our episodes?
I feel like a couple, but it's a pretty rare occurrence.
Yeah. And so let's just say we have a special guest who, from my standpoint, is a very dangerous man. I'll introduce him in a moment. But, in one sense, I want to say if you're currently in a place of heartache where talking about, I'm going to say the word very lowly, politics is troubling enough that you just don't need any more, we're good. Move on to another episode. But let me just say, honestly, this episode isn't really about politics. It's really about the gospel. And if the gospel at the moment is really too dangerous for you, I just want to honor that there are just times that you need to, in one sense, step away. So let me introduce the Reverend Rob Schenck. And I want you to know enough about this man that it may be helpful to have the spelling so that you can go online and begin to explore some of the wonderful things this man has done and said in the context of the last month or so. So it's spelled Schenck. Rob, it is a delight to have you. And to say more, you at one point were the former head of Faith and Action in D.C., dealing with the issues of the gospel that could be often called, mid to right. And in that, there were many things you did that were just beautiful, things that you today would find very problematic. But currently, you are the president of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute in D.C. That, those are just basic beginning points. But to basically say, you are a remarkable man. And whether you like this sentence or not, one that has borne a great deal of both scrutiny and vengeance from people that you were dear friends with. And indeed, some degree of honor, but whenever you become an interplay of whistleblower, but also truth teller, in any context that disrupts the fundamental structure of empire, you bear both danger but also harm. And just to say, immense respect for you and honor to you. So to have you with us, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And just to say, who are you, sir?
I'm still asking that question and will probably ask it for the rest of my earthly days until we're transported into a glorious state where we know ourselves better, I suppose. But first, may I say, Dan, as they say, south of the border, igualmente, I feel the same about you, and lovely to connect with Rachel, and I know there's an Andrew lurking in the shadows, putting
Indeed.
this whole thing together
Yes.
technically. So it's just a pure pleasure to be with all of you. And it's part of my healing journey as much as anything else. And before I forget to say it, may I say that I wouldn't be talking with you if it weren't for the good work, Dan, that you have done for decades now.
Thank
Because it touched me in a powerfully indirect way through my life partner, my best friend, my wife of 49 years in just a few weeks, Cheryl, who ventured out west from the East Coast to sit under your tutelage in several settings, and then in a late in life career change, decided that she had to go to the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, and is today a wonderful psychotherapist helping people in beautiful ways. And so much because of your influence on her thinking and her life and her own spiritual journey. And for me, for much of my 40 years of ministry, I did not spend, this is scandalous to say, but I did not spend a lot of time in my interior world. I was preaching out from the pulpit, out from stages, out into audiences. I was thinking more often of them and their sins rather than my own. And then Cheryl started a journey of her own. And it had a lot to do with her interior life. And eventually that would spill over and influence me. And I started looking inwardly instead of always outwardly. And wow, I had one conversion at age 16 when I gave my life to Jesus as Lord and Savior. You know, what we would think of as sort of, if there is even a conventional conversion, that was it for me. I was born again. I became a Christian. I professed Jesus publicly. And that was the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount, who blessed the poor, who succored the suffering, the lonely, the marginalized, the forgotten, the grieving, blessed the peacemakers, who instead of agitating for conflict, resolved it in themselves and with others. And by the way, since you mentioned the forbidden P word for so many people, I cast my first vote for president for Jimmy Carter, a Democrat. Why? Because to me, he reflected those beatitudes I heard from Jesus in that beautiful sermon. And I said, this is the guy who's a little closer than the other guy. So I voted for that. I wouldn't vote for another Democrat for 40 years. because in the mid-'80s, I went through a second conversion to what I call now, didn't call it back then, Ronald Reagan Republican religion. Distinctly different from the Jesus religion that I first embraced. And it's not to say it was all bad. As you suggested, there were some lovely things to do, and that, frankly, I did. And but over time, the seduction of power, of influence, frankly, of prosperity. The first Jesus movement I embraced wasn't big on private jets, but the second one was. And they're quite comfortable to travel on. I will admit that.
So I've heard.
Yeah, and they are. If you get an opportunity, they're quite comfortable, quite a comfortable way to travel. And it was that gang who thought, that flashing a American Express Cobalt card was a sure sign of God's blessing and pleasure with you. So I drifted off the narrow road that Jesus said leads to life, and got on the boulevard, on the 4-lane expressway that took me right up to Capitol Hill. I spent 30 years there, hobnobbing with the big machas, the big and powerful presidents, leaders of Congress. And the thing that got me into the most trouble in the end was private time with the justices of the Supreme Court, 4 of them in particular. It started out benign enough, prayers in their chambers, gifts of Bibles and plaques of the 10 Commandments. But it quickly turned into something less benign. And, I'll summarize this. I'm sorry to kind of hold forth here, but
Keep going, brother.
well, I'll say it this way, that whenever religion is placed at the service of the political, it corrupts both. And so my own faith was corrupted, but the political apparatus I was engaging was also corrupted by our presence. Religion gives any political actor a unique advantage, because if God intends for this, if this is God's will, then who would dare question it? Because to question it is a form of rebellion. To question God's anointed is a form of rebellion. And rebellion, as the scripture says, is as the sin of witchcraft, and witchcraft is associated with the devil. And who wants to be associated with the devil? So don't raise a question. And that's kind of how it went until I had a moment of truth. And that's another side of the story. So I'll stop my soliloquy at that.
Well, 2 things quickly. First, thank you for that honor, but let's just be very blunt about this. The major change agent was your wife, and her gifting. And Cheryl is a remarkable woman. We could spend, shall we say, a whole nother episode just on your marriage, but we'll, for the moment, leave that as another conversation for another day. But just to say that the intersection of a woman who's really addressing matters of her own heart, her own story, and something of the reality of what we all know to be true, that we are all, to a degree, blinded by our own self-deception. So in her engagement with you and your own engagement with your heart, and the process of disruption of a very, as you have put it, a very comfortable, but also profound life. Comfortable, profound, and in some sense, very meaningful life. There was a turn, and I'd love for you to put some words to what was the turn?
Yeah, well, I guess I could summarize it all in saying that it was the encounter with reality. My best dead friend, you named him, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And by the way, we just merged the Bonhoeffer Institute with the Miller Center for Interreligious Learning and Leadership at Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts.
Oh, congratulations. I know we talked about that a few
Yeah,
year or
yes,
so
we did.
ago. So, yay.
It was a good marriage, and it's working very well for both. I have to tell you that I think of Hebrew College as the kosher version of the Seattle school. Dare I say, I sometimes call it the circumcised version, but that's just a more complicated discussion.
Yeah, well, we would take that with great honor. I would hope they would as well.
They do. They absolutely do. But really, very similar institutions in many ways, even scale, ethos, personalities, approach to text, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of compatibility there. But in any case, it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This, if you're not familiar with him, brilliant, brave, brilliant World War II era, young German church leader, who he was both a pastor and moral philosopher, theologian. And he talked about the propensity of Christians to engage in an endless flight of fancy. We tend to create for ourselves fictitious worlds, imaginative worlds. And there's nothing so bad about imagination unless you live only in that imagination. And in my imagination, during at least 25 to 30 years of work as a Christian advocate in Washington, D.C., engaging with government actors, I had drawn for myself an imaginary world where everything went precisely as God designed it to go. All the formulas worked. The Bible verses always fixed everything. If you just put the 10 Commandments on the wall of your office, you would be sure to obey them. Well, it just doesn't work that way, as we know. And for many, this is a keen sense of the obvious. For me, I was quite obtuse for way too long. But I had encounters here and there. For example, I was in the Montgomery, Alabama County Jail, arrested for defending then the Chief Justice of the state, Roy Moore, for illegally displaying a monument of the 10 Commandments in the chambers of the state Supreme Court. And they threw me literally in the psych wing because the jail was overpopulated. People had a lot of fun when I was put on the psychiatric ward of the jail. But the peculiar thing about that psych ward was that it was, what do we call it? Men and women mixed on the same wing, co-ed. That's a weird way to describe a jail, but it was co-ed. And we weren't in the same cells together, but men and women were on the same wing. And just about 3 doors down from me was a woman who was in great emotional and mental distress. And she screamed the whole time I was there. She kept screaming, "Who's with my babies? I have 3 babies. Who's taking care of my babies? Nobody's. This is tough to even recount. Nobody's with my babies. Now, in my imaginary world, whenever a woman was in distress about her children, she could cry out, and a bevy of church women would show up. And in my mind, I'm sorry to say it, they were white, cherry-cheeked, of a certain disposition, and they would just come flying to people in distress. And they would bring them everything they needed, from diapers and formula to coupons for pediatric care, for their vouchers for free child care, everything they needed. So we would say, for example, why would a woman ever contemplate abortion when there's all kinds of support ready, just available to you? Just say so and we will be there. Nobody came for this woman in the Montgomery County Jail. Not a soul. Not a guard. Not even a guard came to her. She just screamed and was ignored. That was the first crack in my foundation, because I realized that my imaginative helpers never arrived. So here was a person in a situation I said just it doesn't exist in the real world because there's too much help available for them. If they're choosing to abort their child, it must be for selfish reasons. So without getting into, I know you don't want to get into a big discussion about that. That's the session, that's the episode all of its own. But the point for me was simply that what I thought would happen in my perfect world did not happen in the real imperfect world. So that haunted me for a few years, although eventually I packaged it up, put it in a storage facility, and forgot it. But it was one of the first cracks. And then came others, more and more. I remember sitting with a group of Republican Party leaders, and I said, every time we hold a national news conference, we have a phalanx of middle-aged white men. Why don't we bring some women? Why don't we bring in some people of color? This movement needs to look like the people we are. And the response to that was, what would that gain us? Not a single vote. Forget it. On to the next idea, please. That was a harsh reality. And they just kept coming and coming and coming and cracking my foundation. So I won't give you a whole catalog. It's just way too long. But that was the start of it.
Yeah. Something about self-deception is part of the creating of an illusory word. And in that, the idea that it is the cries of the heartbroken that is meant to awaken us all. And yet, at some level, you chose to listen, even if it took a long period. You didn't, shall we say, harden the surface to keep the cries mute, to say again, thank you. Rachel, I know your mind's going somewhere.
Well, I'm just grateful for this language of imagination because, I've been so moved by Serene Jones's use of disordered imagination to talk about what she was borrowing, kind of like a pre-psychology term, from doctors trying to make sense of traumatized people, and like the hysteria and the trauma and how like there was no return to like a rightly ordered imagination. However we imagine that. But she's talking about spiritual imagination really and how we get disordered. And I think for so many of us, it's, you think about, the disorder comes from harm or the disorder comes from, something outside of this system. But I'm grateful for what you're putting words to is that no, actually, for many of us, it is the theological, religious systems we're being formed in that are actually contributing to a very disordered imagination. And I echo what Dan's saying. I think when those cracks and fragments come, it's really scary. It's really existential. And it also is such an exposure and confrontation with our privilege, that we haven't had experiences, or we've somehow been able to, I would say, spiritually bypass or make sense of a very painful experience of suffering to keep this imagination of God intact, right? That everything's ordered, and if you just do things the right way, it works out for you. And so I am very struck by your tenderness to be moved to let reality in. I think for so many people, what we're seeing right now is a doubling down on not being moved by what is true and real because it feels too threatening, to, I think, fragile spiritual imagination, but I also think very threatening to power and prosperity. And understandably so, because it is actually threatening to those things.
Mhm.
Indeed. And the rule applies across the board. For me, I had my own imagination of my family and how healthy we were or had to be. And I discovered we were not. And that, of course, led to my own revelation that I was not healthy. And that even my relationship to God, to the gospel, the message that I was the bearer, I was ordained as an evangelist, literally, as a proclaimer of the gospel. And I did that all over the world, traveling all over the world, proclaiming the gospel. And with time, that gospel, I bent it, I distorted it, I massaged it, and then I tortured it into something that was no longer the gospel. It was almost an anti-gospel. First of all, it excluded too many people. When I see the invitation of the gospel being to all, come, everyone that thirsts, come, everyone in need, come.